Thank you, and hopefully the microphones are working all here. So thank you for joining us today on this beautiful day. The topic of this panel, the workforce of the 21st century, is absolutely critical to everything this administration wants to do. I think Margaret Weiker's comments at the beginning of the day were really spot on. You cannot accomplish government agencies' missions without the right people with the right skills, and that's what this is all about. So I'd like to start with Michael Rigas, and this is his first public appearance since assuming the job at OPM, so we're very happy to have him. But I'd like Michael to frame this issue for us in the context of the president's management agenda, as well as the executive orders President Trump signed about 10 days ago, focused on the streamlining the removal authority, as well as working with the public sector unions.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with everyone today. As you know, OPM has a critical role to play as in part of the president's management agenda related to the workforce and addressing the question, how do we get better results? And one of the three sort of pillars of how we are going about addressing better results is through digitization of our data, improving our technology, and celebrating the federal workforce. A lot of attention gets paid to folks in the federal workforce who maybe aren't meeting the standards that the American people expect, but there are a lot of folks who show up on time every day, work very hard to achieve results for the American people, and it's important that we make sure we recognize the hard work that they do. And part of the work is that the president's executive orders, which he signed last week, works to start to address some of these issues in response to federal employees. In the federal employee viewpoint survey, I believe over 60% of them said they did not think that their agencies or management were doing enough to be able to manage poor performers in the workplace. And one of the EOs works to streamline that process. We've gone out and sort of polled agencies on what they're doing with respect to that area, and we found that there are a lot of processes and procedures that are in place at individual agencies that aren't required by law or by OPM-issued regulations. And this is an effort to streamline this and make sure that high-performing employees are rewarded and recognized, and poor-performing employees are managed and addressed. The other two executive orders that were signed by the president address taxpayer-funded union time. There are numerous instances where federal employees are spending 100% of their time or 75% of their time doing things other than what their job description says they ought to be doing. They're working 100% of the time on union activities. And this is an effort to basically address that and say, look, that's important work that needs to be done, but can we find a right balance where they're spending most of their time doing the job that they were hired to do and a smaller percentage of their time doing non-federal work on taxpayer dollars. And the third executive order addressed how federal agencies go about negotiating collective bargaining agreements. And we've seen at agencies collective bargaining negotiations go on for years. And before the agency and the unions can even get to negotiating the issues at stake, they're talking about the shape of the table, the room that they're going to meet in, who's going to be there, and you have all sort of these pre-issues. And this basically works to say, hey, these issues, there's a certain amount of time you have to discuss how we're going to go about the negotiating process, and then we're going to move on to the substantive issues. And these things really do not need to go on for years. They can be done in a matter of months, really. So those are the issues. Those are obviously have generated some controversy recently. So, but we'll see how those play out in the courts.
Okay, thank you. So Angela, how is this playing out at Homeland Security, which of course is one of the largest departments in government? What's it like where the rubber meets the road, as the expression goes?
All right, so first of all, thank you for having me here today. So I would say mainly from a department standpoint, one of the things that we're doing is we're, first of all, going through all the executive orders, as you can imagine, having really good conversations with the Office of Personnel Management. In fact, we have a conversation with them, I think, a little bit later on today to actually discuss the executive orders. So I think a couple of things from my standpoint. One, we want to look at this from a federal-wide perspective to make sure that we have consistency, if you will, as best that we can from a federal-wide perspective. Then within DHS, how do we ensure that we have consistency within DHS, but yet balance and respect the fact that we have subcultures within cultures, right? And so we have unions that are within some of our components, and I think we just need to be respectful of many of the past practices and the longstanding negotiated agreements and the relationships that have been built over time. But we need to balance that with the spirit and the intent of the executive orders, and where we need to go as not only a department, but also as the federal government. So I think it's this marvelous balancing act of making sure that we have consistency where it makes sense, but that we kind of respect the individuality of some of the situations that are going on, because there's just not one size fits all. There's not an answer or a silver bullet that's going to be able to address every specific issue.
I'm sure that's true, and that's an issue for many departments that have very diverse agencies. So, Chris, give us a higher level view of this, if you would. GAO has looked at these workforce issues for many years across multiple administrations that have tried to address some of these same challenges. Tell us what you see as the real opportunity here for the Trump administration, but also the challenges they're going to face.
Sure, and I join Angie and others in thanking Government Executive and Grant Thornton for having me here today. That this is a great conversation to have. A couple of areas where our work is focused on that I think can be informative and helpful to agencies. First is on critical skills gaps. Is that, as many of you know, we have a high-risk issue or a high-risk series that looks at kind of major programs and functions and operations in the government that are at risk. One of the government-wide high-risk issues is critical skills gap. And it's been on our, a couple of decades now. And, what we focus on is not just individual agencies and their skills gaps that are pretty widely known, whether it be nurses at VA or veterinarians and, but government-wide occupations and the challenges associated with that, IT and cyber, the acquisition workforce, the grants workforce, which is one that I think is kind of underappreciated given the size of the grants that go out to state and local governments, over $600 billion a year. And so we look at critical skills gaps and the need to address those. But increasingly what we're finding, or what agencies are letting us know about, is that the types of skills gaps that they have don't fall neatly into the GS system, into the classification system that we have. And so, for example, a couple of years ago when we met with chief performance officers within agencies, and they said they really need people with skills in data analytics, data visualization, root cause analysis, and yeah, we can shoehorn that into the standards that are associated with the management analyst or kind of budget analyst, but it really doesn't fall neatly, and which makes both recruiting, compensation, training development a real challenge for those types of occupations. I would also say that one of the things in dealing with critical skills gaps is that we need to make sure that we're looking into the longer term, and that is that we understand that we're not only filling the needs for today, which are absolutely vital, but that we're also understanding is what are the business operations that our agency is going to have 5, 10, 15 years from now, and make sure that we're hiring and developing and training on the skills that we're going to need for them. And this is basically foresight analysis and kind of the integration of strategic planning into human capital planning. But too often we'll see, when we go into agencies, we'll see, and it's the urgent drives out the important, that we'll see people just focusing on the here and now and what they have to do today in order to fill a gap, rather than thinking more long term as to what business are we going to be in? Well, how are we going to operate into the future? And let's make sure that we're beginning to build on those. So one broad area is that critical skills gap. Second broad area that we spend a lot of time looking at is employee engagement. Through the Employee Viewpoint Survey, which is just such a rich, incredible data set, and so I would join Margaret, make sure that you answer your survey if you're a federal employee, but also the level of granularity that we have now, and in time series analysis, it's a very powerful indicator of how organizations are doing and whether or not their employees are effectively engaged. And there's a lot of questions on the Employee Viewpoint Survey, yet through statistical analysis that we've done, we've really isolated like 6 or so questions that are absolutely vital to getting improved employee engagement. And if you really work on those, and a lot of them turn on the relationship between the individual and their first line supervisor and conversations that they're having, you're going to do a much better job in terms of engagement and therefore mission accomplishment. And then third, and very briefly, the area that that we spend a lot of time on is worried about diversity and inclusion. I mean, that's both an absolute imperative as a democratic society that we have a workforce that mirrors our population. And it's a business case because we want to make sure that we are drawing on the diverse and broad talents and experiences and just demographics of all of America to make sure that we have those types of conversations, those people that are engaged in working within our organizations. There's that wonderful line that I know we've all heard about is diversity is when you have a bunch of different people sitting at the lunch table together. Inclusion is when they're actually talking to each other. And so we can sure get to a diverse workforce. We now need to work on making sure that we have an inclusive workforce where we're actually drawing on those talents, drilling them right into mission accomplishment, because that's how we're going to get a better organization.
Thank you. So I'd like to go back to Michael, and you mentioned the Employee Viewpoint Survey, and employees, for the last several surveys have really overwhelmingly said that agencies don't do a good enough job in removing poor performers, and that hurts everyone. And I think there's plenty of data to show that. But I'm wondering if, because the administration has come out so strongly focused on dealing with poor performers, if that doesn't send a message that makes it very difficult to recruit at a time when people are wondering, are they valued? So could you address that tension?
That's the part that gets a lot of attention. The president also noted very, the first thing he mentioned, I think it was in his State of the Union address, was the need to recognize high performers. And that didn't get as much attention as managing the low performers because, for whatever reason, but one of the things that has been introduced to sort of help address this issue is the Workforce Modernization Fund, where that's going to be $1 billion fund and set up to provide agencies flexibility to reward high performers, to provide retention, relocation, and hiring incentives to make sure we are attracting the best and the brightest. With unemployment now dropping down to historic lows, the federal government's in a position now where it's really competing for the best and the brightest with the private sector. Less than 1% of the federal workforce is under 25 years old, 6% is under 30 years old. We need to do our part to attract this younger cohort, especially as the cohort of employees in the federal government who are retirement eligible or approaching retirement eligibility. We need to ask ourselves the question, what do we need to do to be able to compete for the best and the brightest talent? And some of the initiatives which we have underway and which are being proposed to provide more flexibility, to provide more incentives, to reward high performance and recognize high performers, I think going to be a big part of that effort. And I think we just need to do a better job of talking about what those initiatives are.
Another aspect of this that I feel really is sometimes underplayed is the importance of training in virtually all aspects of whether it's performance management, which the administration is really pushing, whether it's reskilling the workforce or giving people the skills they need as technology evolves. Angela, how at DHS, a very diverse department, how are you, first, do you have enough training funds? And second, what are your priorities? How are you balancing all these needs?
So training is incredibly important. at the Department of Homeland Security, especially because of our mission set. So we invest heavily in our law enforcement training. There's lots of certifications and weapons qualifications and et cetera that needs to be done. FEMA, for example, with our first responders and stuff, the kind of training that they need is critical. Also our cybersecurity folks, that's another area where we have invested heavily in training. But I think over the course of the years, we've thought of training as being this big, massive training fund, and then the first time that budget cuts come, it's the first thing we cut.
Right.
So we run around and we say training's really important, and then it's the first thing that we cut. And so at least it's just been my experience throughout my career that you fund what's important to you. And so really at the Department of Homeland Security, we've made a conscious effort to ensure that we are funding our programs, not just the mission training aspects, but also ensuring that we're funding the leadership development. We have a STONES program, as we like to call it, but it's to provide leadership development from the GS5 clear up through the SCS, and it ends with a capstone program. And so I think that ensuring that we invest in training, I really like what the military often says, that you train the way you fight and you fight the way you train, right? And so I think that that's what the civilian agencies need to kind of get into that mindset as well. But we really need to rethink about what we call training and how we actually invest in that. So typically, you will find that we have, again, a training fund, and then we just salami slice it, and everybody gets $250, right? And you get to go to a certain management class, and the other one gets to try to figure it out on their own or read a book or whatever. But what we're finding is, and in fact, I was talking with some of our cybersecurity professionals just recently, and the training for cybersecurity professionals can run anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000 a year. And training can also be things like going to Black Hat conferences, right, or RSA conferences. It's not necessarily just sitting in a classroom and just learning off of a webinar. It's actually going in, networking, consulting, and really, maybe it's a hackathon. Maybe it's something different. And so the whole mindset around training, I think we need to get with the 21st century, and we need to invest in it the same way that the military does.
That's a good point. We are going to open this up for questions, so if you have one, raise your hand and someone will be around with the mic. Before we take the first question, though, I want to ask Chris to comment on training and why that's such a challenge for government.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with Angela on that, is that, we underfund it. It's unfortunately among the very first things to be cut, which is why there's not a lot of transparency in the budget process about it. We all have very good political incentives to making sure that it's marbled in with other things rather than line itemed out. What I would build on what Angela was saying is that, and this is in addition to and not in lieu of, which is making sure that we have a broad perspective on it, and that also includes development opportunities. Is that what we find with many of the mission challenges that we face today is that, where, all the problems the government's trying to achieve are cross-cutting, and therefore they're going to be, solutions to them are going to be collaborative in nature. That requires a whole different type of skill set, kind of a reskilling, as you were mentioning. And so it's things like more of a premium on facilitation, negotiation, working across agency boundaries, working across sectors and levels of government. That certainly there's a good classroom or web-based training component that can be helpful for that. Fundamentally, though, that's going to be experiential, and it's going to be something to the extent that we can put people in development opportunities that actually help them grow and sharpen their skills in that. And so we put a big premium on looking at interagency rotation programs, moving people around even if within their own agencies and give them different experiences, making sure that they're sensitive to different ways of doing work and working across organizational boundaries.
If I could just add on to that, so it just reminded me of something. So like at DHS, one of the things that we just implemented was a joint duty program. Because to your point, and there is, what I keep saying all the time, we are 240,000 strong. There is so much talent in this agency. And so one of the things we had at our Coast Guard Academy, they were struggling to get some professors in specific skills. I think some was in cyber and some was in leadership, some different things. But anyhow, we put out a joint duty announcement. and they were just going to hire like one professor, right? We got so many talented folks who applied to go to the Coast Guard Academy out of DHS that I think they selected like 2 or 3, and they have like 2 on a waiting list. And so I think it's right that you have to think about training beyond the traditional, right? There's not so much non-traditional learning and stuff. And one of the reasons, like, we talk about poor performers, but really it's like almost less than 3% of the federal workforce has an issue, whether it's performance or discipline. I've done a lot of research and tried to see, okay, well, in the private sector, what is that? And it's fascinating, like, you can't really find any statistics on this, right? Mm-hmm. What is an average company running with regard to a performance issue and a conduct issue? But our focus at DHS has been, let's stop worrying so much about the 3%. How about if we put some time actually into the 97% who come to work every day, do a great job, and really are dedicated? How about if we invest as much time and energy as we possibly can into that 97%? And I think that it's really starting to pay dividends for us.
Great point.
And I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. So I apologize to all of you with questions. No. This was.
You asked the question. We answered it for you.
Which I was just teasing. Thank you, all of you. This is such an important topic, and we could go on all day, but we'll all get in trouble if we do.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.